I'm glad you ended with that question. Why are these crimes undeterrable? Because I'm going to have some things to say about that, not legal things, but having to do more with the sociocultural circumstances under which mothers mother. So one area of focus in my research is feminist care ethics, and feminist care ethics is that branch of philosophical inquiry that discusses, analyzes the ethical background of mothering practice. Or you could even say analyzes mothering as an ethical practice. So I'm not going to say anything about the law in my comments, but I'm going to focus on the cultural and socio-symbolic context and also the material context in which courts exercise judgment over mothers who kill, and in which mothers kill their children. My study of feminist care ethics and my own experience as the mother of 4 adopted children who had been adopted after they had seen a lot of trauma, so they were all adopted older, meaning they weren't infants. And for me, this has taught me that the conditions under which motherhood is practiced, the social organization of motherhood as an institution in our culture, make motherhood a source of great danger to children. So I wanted to say that again. Motherhood as an institution of our culture, as the institution of our culture through which we have decided as a society children should be cared for, makes motherhood a danger to children. And I know that sounds strange to say, because motherhood, of course, is also the singular institution where we have decided to put all of the responsibility for keeping children alive. So it is both a dangerous place for children, and it is that place that's the only place that our culture concentrates, or almost the only place that our culture concentrates responsibility for keeping children alive and well. So if we want to think about the ethical situation of women who kill, the first thing we have to remember is that women are the ones, for the most part, who are assigned to keep kids alive. And women are, by and large, isolated in that responsibility. No one else, not fathers, not the community, not the schools, not the courts, are assigned that primary responsibility in the same way that mothers are in our culture. And I don't mean this in every single case. You will find cases, of course, where the father is the primarily responsible one, but by and large, that's not the case. That's not true. By and large, it is a woman who is in a mothering position who has that responsibility. And at the same time, I think there are heavy moral burdens on women who find themselves in the position of mothering a child. And to talk about those burdens, I want to read or share with you 3 texts that I think point to those burdens in a particularly poignant way. The first one is a Victorian poem, which is the kind of ode to maternal love. And it's very short. This is how it goes. There was a young man loved a maid who taunted him. Are you afraid, she asked, to bring me today your mother's head upon a tray? He went and slew his mother dead, tore from her breast her heart so red. Then toward his lady love he raced, but tripped and fell in all his haste. As the heart rolled on the ground, it gave forth a plaintive sound, and it spoke in accents mild. Did you hurt yourself, my child? So I read this poem to you because I think it particularly strongly expresses that idealization of maternal love that requires of mothering persons self-sacrifice, the sacrifice of pleasure, that sacrifice of identity, the sacrifice of their own freedom and projects in the world. The second text is from Toni Morrison's novel, Sula. And in this novel, there is a character, Eva, who is also sometimes just called Mama. And she has invested much love in her last child, Plum, to whom, Toni Morrison writes, she hoped to bequeath everything. Now, Plum grows up and he returns from the First World War. He's an alcoholic and a drug addict. He hangs out in his mother's house and listens to records all day and gets high. So one night, Mama Eva goes to his room, holds him and rocks him in his half-high stupor. And before she leaves the room, she soaks him and his bed with kerosene and lights him on fire, killing him. And when the character is called on to explain her actions, this is what she says. He give me such a time. Looked like he didn't even want to be born. But he come on out. Boys is hard to bear. You wouldn't know that, but they is. It was such a carrying on to get him born and to keep him alive. Just to keep his little heart beating and his little old lungs cleared, and looked like when he came back from that war, he wanted to get back in. After all that carrying on, just getting him out and keeping him alive, he wanted to crawl back in my womb. And, well, I ain't got the room no more, even if he could do it. There wasn't space for him in my womb, and he was crawling back. So in this text, instead, we have a mother who is refusing the care of her child. Now, Toni Morrison makes it an adult child, which I think changes the tone of it a little bit. But I still think it symbolizes that selfishness of the mother that results in a criminal act. And then the last text is the story of Julie, who's a real mother with a real baby who won't sleep and a largely absent father. And I think this is probably that more typical case that you were referring to. And this is the story of one night. It's told by Sarah Ruddock, a catechist. And there's a citation in the text from Julie's diary. On that night, Julie, alone with the baby, slept lightly. So she's exhausted. She hasn't been sleeping for night after night. Her husband's not around. Though the baby seemed well and was quiet in her dreams, Julie heard the familiar cries. Dreams soon revealed reality. The baby was wailing as usual, or rather screaming. How difficult it is to remember what it is like when a baby screams. And then here's the citation from Julie's diary. I stumble towards your room and switch on the low lamp so the light will not startle you. You toss your body back and forth, arch your back and wail and call. Trembling, I walk to your bed and check your diaper. I try to speak, to soothe, to give voice to my presence, but my throat constricts in silent screaming, and I find I cannot touch your tangled blankets. I force myself to turn and walk away, leaning against the door jamb. My knees buckle beneath me, and I find myself huddled on the floor. Please do not cry. Oh, child I love, please do not cry. Tonight you can breathe, so let me breathe. And I realize my chest is locked and I'm gasping for breath. I picture myself walking towards you, lifting your tininess in both my hands and flinging you at the window. Mixed with my choking, I can almost hear the glass as it would smash, and I see your body, your perfect body, swirl through the air and land 3 stories below on the pavement. Sickened by her vision, Julie vomited and then felt calmer. After changing the baby's diaper and propping a warm bottle so that she could drink, Julie shut the door to the baby's room, barricading it against herself with a large armchair. Later that night, she carefully wrapped her daughter in blankets, carried her downstairs, and rode a bus from one end of the city to another, thinking you would be safe with me if we were not alone, she writes. So I want to use these 3 texts to talk about what I'm calling the ethical background in which we need to consider maternal failure, I guess I would call it. On the one hand, we have the idealization of maternal practice, the good mother figure that has this moral weight that sits on women's actual maternal practices, the good mother who sacrifices autonomy, pleasure, or self-interest for her children. On the other hand, we have the bad mother figure that also haunts maternal practice and sits heavily on mothers' shoulders. Mothers talk about always comparing themselves to other mothers to see if they're good or bad, to see if their mothering is good enough to qualify as this good mother cultural figure rather than the bad mother. And in the third situation, we have what is the ethically impossible circumstances under which women mother. Complete isolation, physical exhaustion, being overwhelmed, and having these 2 weights sitting on your shoulders of the good mother and the bad mother at the same time. So in actual mothering practice, mothers experience a paradox of power and powerlessness. On the one hand, anytime you put a 150-pound adult in a room with a 10-pound infant or a 20-pound toddler, the power is absolute. The physical power is absolute. And Toni Morrison's Eva, I think, symbolizes this absolute maternal power, even though Morrison uses an adult child in her example. At the same time, the mother experiences herself as nearly absolutely powerless. the social power of real mothers to affect the circumstances in which they mother is very small. The existential power to get enough sleep, to move freely around the world when you've got children who are dependent on you, is, you don't have much of that either. And then, of course, children are these autonomous little creatures that torture you. Because they cry, they insist, they demand, and you can't control that. You can only manage it. So that's another dimension of powerlessness. So the paradox of power in mothering is this. When you have very little power to control the conditions of your own life, but you have absolute physical power over another human being, this creates, I think, a dangerous situation, and this is why I'm saying that motherhood is itself dangerous to children, the way that we have organized it. And in these circumstances, many mothers report feeling every maternal failure as a kind of condemnation of themselves in the very core of who they are. So my question is, then, in actual cases of child abuse and neglect, how is it that the demonization of the perpetrator actually participates in perpetuating this cult of idealized motherhood as opposed to bad motherhood? And I found that in reading some of the materials that was on the Child Advocacy Project website in preparation for today, several cases were mentioned where the judge admonished the mother not for her failure as a human being, but for her failure as a mother. You don't even fit the definition of mother was one of the citations. And I think that this kind of cultural message participates in perpetuating this cult of idealized versus demonized motherhood. When Angela McAnulty was tried and convicted for the murder of her daughter Jeanette, and I'm not suggesting, of course, that she should not have been tried and convicted. I live in North Eugene. This happened in my neighborhood. It was, incredibly shocking and viscerally horrifying event for everyone. But we don't try the biological father, who hadn't been in touch with Jeanette in nearly a decade, for failing to participate in keeping her alive. We don't convict the broader family or the community or the school or the church or the social services or the other institutions that were involved in Angela and Jeanette's lives. We isolate the mother in her extreme responsibility for the life of the child. So my message is that when we're judging mothers who kill, and they have to be judged, I'm not again suggesting that they should not be judged, we also need to judge the kind of world that we've built in which mothering practice is this intensified, isolated, impossible situation of responsibility for many mothers, especially those who do not have the material resources to ease those burdens. We need to also judge the institutions that shape the lives in our communities and the social symbolic context in which we continue to perpetuate that story of idealized motherhood, which has as its reverse the bad mother and makes mothering practice so fraught for so many of us. The fact that this experience that I recounted of Julie, who wanted to throw her baby out the window, is absolutely ubiquitous in mothering practice. And we don't like to talk about it. It's taboo. Mothers don't say it. But when mothers are interviewed and they feel that they can speak freely, the vast majority of them say, I have wanted to hurt or kill my children. So that impulse it's more than common. It's absolutely generalized in mothering practice. Also.